Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Daniel Ghezelbash, and I'm a professor of law and the director of the Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law at UNSW. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. I'm delighted to welcome you to this speed briefing on our new Kaldor Centre and Behavioural Insights Team report, Countering Misinformation about Refugees and Migrants, an evidence-based approach. The purpose of this report is to tap into the latest research from behavioral science to explain how misinformation works and how that knowledge can empower all of us to stop its spread. I'm going to begin with some initial framing around our motivations for initiating this project, and then hand over to Saul Wodak, who's an advisor from the Behavioural Insights Team and the lead author of our new report. Saul is going to walk you through the behavioral science of misinformation, a step-by-step framework for countering misinformation, and tips for engagement strategies to maximize impact. We'll then have time left at the end for questions, and please feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A as we go through the presentation. It's worth briefly setting out the bigger picture and explaining why we took this on. Misinformation is one of the biggest threats currently facing our society. It undermines social cohesion and leads to a more fragmented society. For us to be able to come together to collectively work on shared problems, we need to have a shared vision. Misinformation undermines this. When we can't agree on the facts, we can't have meaningful public discussion or develop shared goals. We can't address the real issues that we face, and instead we get bad policies and a weakened democracy. Refugee and migration issues are an area where misinformation is particularly pervasive, especially in the lead up to elections. While this puts us all at risk, the worst consequences, discrimination, social exclusion, and harmful policies impact refugees and migrants themselves. And sometimes misinformation is specifically targeted at migrant communities, sowing division in an effort to influence elections. To meet the challenge of misinformation about refugees and migrants, the Kaldor Centre naturally reached for strategies rooted in evidence. We initiated a collaboration with the Behavioural Insights Team, a social purpose consulting firm that gained renown as the UK government's nudge unit in 2010, applying behavioural science to public policy. The result of our work is a BIT report. The result of our work with BIT is a report that helps us understand how misinformation works and what to do about it. Bad faith actors are incredibly savvy and coordinated when it comes to spreading misinformation. We see this in Trump's approach, and we also saw in the very effective No campaign in last year's Indigenous Voice referendum. Those of us who want to effectively push back against misinformation need to get more savvy, and we hope that this report provides a foundation to do that. Before we take you through the report, it's important to clarify what it does and doesn't do. It's designed to help you decide what to do when you counter misinformation. Many of you would have already grappled with the struggle of countering misinformation, and questions like whether you should ignore it and hope it goes away, whether you should say something, and if so, what should you say? The framework takes some of the guesswork out of this. But it's important to be clear that the report is not a playbook prescribing wording for every falsehood about refugees and migrants, and it's also not a messaging guide or campaign strategy or copy and paste collateral. Instead, what it offers is a structured framework for deciding whether and how to respond, underpinned by key principles of behavioral science. I'll now hand over to Saul to talk us through those principles.
Thank you, Daniel. So I'm going to start by describing why misinformation is such a big problem right now. So the reason I'm starting there is we need to first understand the nature of the beast that we're dealing with in order to work out how to then address it. So we see two types of factors as critical to the drive and spread of misinformation at the moment. The first are our media environments. So online platforms create the perfect breeding ground for misinformation to spread. On these platforms, information travels instantly across the world. Very little of it is fact-checked or subject to basic media standards of accuracy, and people share content between social and family groups that can easily become echo chambers that entrench and polarize attitudes. We're also seeing a rise in AI-generated information, such as deepfakes, which makes it harder to tell fact from fiction. The second type of factor behind the spread of misinformation is our human psychology. The way we process information makes us particularly vulnerable to online misinformation. Or I could put this in reverse. Misinformation is often deliberately created to prey on our psychological biases. So as a starting point for this project, we reviewed the literature and distilled 6 key behavioural principles that are central to the spread of misinformation. If you could advance the slide, please. So the first is called hot states. So misinformation is fear or outrage. The case in point is Donald Trump's recent assertion that immigrants are eating the cats. Emotional states disable our critical thinking skills. We become reactive and impulsively accept misinformation without verifying it. We even share news stories without reading them. The second principle is called the messenger effect. We judge the truth of a message by who is them, often when it contradicts expert consensus. So we saw this play out in COVID with an increase in skepticism for governments and experts like Fauci and the Center for Disease Control in the US, and people looking to friends and family for medical advice. The third principle is called the mere exposure effect. So there are over 400 studies that have researched this effect. The more times we see something, whether true or false, the more we trust and believe it. So this tells us that misinformation that has gone viral poses a great risk of harm, and not just because more people are seeing it, but because more people are also believing it. The fourth principle is confirmation bias. People believe information that aligns with their existing views and reject offhand what challenges them. This means that misinformation about issues that are polarizing, like migration or refugees, are often harder to correct because people come from a starting point of having deeply entrenched and fixed beliefs. The fifth principle is cognitive load. Online environments have near infinite amounts of information. When we're overloaded with choice and information, we take mental shortcuts. Social media, where we scroll quickly through competing posts, is the perfect environment for misinformation to spread. And finally, the sixth principle is the continued influence effect. Even after a false claim is debunked, misinformation leaves a lasting impact on our emotions, judgments, and decision-making. So this has been studied on political misinformation, where false claims from political candidates are later corrected. What happens is people update their beliefs, but the misinformation has a lasting impact on their support and voting intentions. So in summary, these 6 principles explain how misinformation leads to false beliefs and poor decision-making. And we use these principles alongside an extensive review of misinformation research literature to build the practical framework, which I'll talk to now. Okay, so it's a good starting point to acknowledge that we're dealing with a crowded attention economy out there. And as Dan mentioned earlier, we have very sophisticated bad faith actors that are flooding the internet with misinformation. So trying to respond to every piece of misinformation is impossible, and in some cases, it could be counterproductive. So we've developed an easy to follow framework, and this will help you decide when to ignore information, when to act, and how to act effectively. So I'll now talk through the decision tree by stepping us through a few of the key decision points. The first one is to determine whether the misinformation is expected or already out there. So sometimes false information is likely, but it hasn't yet emerged. So some potential scenarios are that it may have, a narrative might have appeared overseas, but it's not yet arrived in Australia. or we might be expecting to see a particular kind of misinformation because of where we are in the election cycle. So in this situation, the best response is pre-bunking. Pre-bunking is best understood through the analogy of inoculation. Like receiving a vaccine in your arm, pre-bunking exposes people to small doses of misinformation to build resistance to future exposures. So an effective pre-bunk has two key elements. The first is called a motivational warning. This alerts people to the bad faith actors and their motivations. So this is the why of misinformation. What's in it for them? Consider these two examples. Fossil fuel-funded think tanks are spreading uncertainty about climate change to delay action. This benefits their funders. Political actors shift blame for societal issues onto refugees and migrants because spreading fear is an easy win for political gain. Now, the reason this approach works is that nobody likes to be manipulated. So calling out the why encourages skepticism and critical thinking in your audience towards future misinformation. The second element of an effective pre-bunk message is called preemptive refutation. So this explains how misinformation is false. So there's two components to a preemptive refutation. The first is technique-based. This highlights the particular persuasive tactics that misinformation spreaders use, such as emotional manipulation, selective framing, or cherry-picking of data. For instance, a straw man argument might say, advocates for refugee rights want open borders and unlimited migration. So this clearly misrepresents the position of advocacy groups so that it's an easy position to attack. Research shows that explaining how these tactics are used to manipulate public opinion helps people spot and resist the same tactics used elsewhere in the future. The second element of a preemptive refutation is called issue-based. So this approach educates audiences to have a deeper understanding of a particular issue. The more contextual information that people have around an issue, the more resistant they are to false information, because falsities don't then fit into their schema and understanding of an issue. So the best pre-bunking messages combine elements of all three of these approaches: the motivational warning, a technique-based refutation, and an issue-based refutation. And you can see these strategies in action in our report. We've included a worked example which pre-bunks anticipated misinformation about refugees and migrants. Okay, so we'll move to our next decision point. What if instead we've assessed the evidence and decided that the misinformation is already out there? How do we know if we should act or not? So if misinformation is already circulating, you ask what are known as the 3 Ps to decide whether to respond. Is it prominent, persuasive, and proximate? By prominent, we mean isn't gaining traction or visibility. By persuasive, we mean does it have the potential to change beliefs or behavior? And is it proximate? Is it being shared by sources close to your audience? So if misinformation is not prominent, persuasive, and proximate, what you want to do is ignore it for the moment and focus on reframing the agenda. And there are a few reasons for this. Firstly, you don't want to unnecessarily risk amplifying the falsehoods by shining a spotlight on them. Secondly, we don't want to let the bad faith actors control the narrative. So this strategy is about taking back control of public discourse. Reframing the agenda is about promoting accurate, values-driven narratives that align with your organization's goals. Similar to the issue-based refutation tactic I talked to just before, this tactic shapes our society's values and knowledge around an issue, and it makes us more resilient to misinformation about refugees and migrants in the future. So what if misinformation is gaining traction? In other words, if misinformation is prominent, persuasive, and proximate, then what we want to do is debunk it. So I'll now talk about how you can debunk misinformation effectively. So debunking can be tricky. We risk amplifying false claims or reinforcing them in people's minds if we talk about them. However, more recent evidence suggests that these backfire effects are actually rarer than we previously thought. So we reviewed the research and identified the best approach for debunking. And this is called the fact sandwich, or the FMFF method. And that stands for fact, myth, fallacy, fact. So in this approach, you start with a compelling fact or truth about the matter. You then move on to warn about the misinformation. This is the myth. And you do so briefly and by diluting the misinformation to take the heat out of it. And this is to reduce the risk of a backfire effect. Third, you point out the fallacy. You want to explain the flaw in the misinformation. Similar to pre-bunking, you want to highlight the manipulation technique at play or where the particular evidence is incorrect. There are particular frameworks you can refer to. One in particular is called the Flick framework, and that's included in the report. This framework shows a large number of fallacies that can help you identify which one fits the identified misinformation that you want to debunk. We've also experimented with using ChatGPT with carefully worded prompts, and this can also help you to identify which fallacy is at play. And finally, you want to end by reinforcing the initial fact. So this approach, or this fact sandwich approach, helps structure your corrections to make them clear, credible, and effective. Now, the reason you want to start and end with the fact is because of two behavioral science principles known as the primacy and recency effects. We're more likely to remember the first and last bits of information we see. So in messaging, the first and last sentences really matter. We also want to recognize that sometimes facts on their own aren't very compelling. Emotions and values also play a large part in public persuasion. So I'll talk to this in a moment when I discuss engagement strategies, which is the third section of our report. But it's important to think about this when coming up with debunking messages and when selecting which fact you want to use. You want to be correct, but you also want to be compelling and convincing. So I'll now hand back to Daniel, who will talk through a worked example of how to apply these techniques in a debunking message.
So before I jump into that, it might be worth addressing one of the questions that has come up in the chat, because it relates directly to what you're talking about now, about how effective myth busting is, and hasn't there been research that suggests it may help promote the original myths?
So myth busting, I'm not sure what the technical definition of myth busting is, but I'm imagining it's similar to correcting facts or providing corrections. And so there were originally many concerns in the behavioral science literature, probably about 10 years ago, that if you don't correctly debunk or correct a myth, that there is a risk of it amplifying the misinformation. And what we mean by this is it adds heat to it, it adds credibility and strength to it. And this is because of the behavioral science principle that I talked to initially, called the mere exposure effect. The more times you encounter a piece of misinformation, the more strength it gets, the more validity and credibility it gets. But what we've found in more recent research is that when misinformation is debunked in a careful and strategic way, the risk of backfire effects is actually very low. And this is covered in the report.
Thanks, Saul. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So in the report, as Saul has foreshadowed, we've got a number of how-to guides that show you both the pre-bunking and debunking approach in action. But I think it's important to note that these aren't there for you to kind of copy and paste in your own use, but really there as examples of how to implement these strategies in practice. And sometimes it can be more an art than a science when it comes to picking which facts you want to rely on, because often there'll be multiple ones, but also around which values you engage, which you think will be most persuasive for your audience. But here, this is a worked up example here around some common misinformation we've been seeing out there around the link between migration and housing. So we start with leading with a fact. So when Australia's borders were closed during COVID-19, migration was at its lowest in a century, yet house prices still went up. The idea that cutting migration will magically solve the housing crisis doesn't hold up against the evidence. Then we warn about the myth. But instead of tackling the real issues, some political actors are blaming migrants as if they're the main reason housing has become unaffordable. And then we explain the fallacy. They are oversimplifying the problem to distract you from the actual causes. The housing crisis has been a long time in the making, and it's now this severe because of past policy choices and mistakes piling up. It's easier for them to blame migrants and divide us than to take real action. And then ending with the fact again, there are many drivers of Australia's housing crisis, including a lack of housing, rising construction costs, and tax breaks that distort the market. Migration is only a small piece of the puzzle. Don't let them trick you into using migrants as a distraction from real housing policy reform. So you can find the other 4 worked up how-to guides as an appendix to our report. But I'll hand over back to Saul now to talk about engagement strategies.
Great, thanks, Dan. So I'll just actually add a continued response to how I responded to the previous question by just saying the whole kind of reason that we did this report is to look at the evidence about what works, what minimizes those backfire effects, but what has the highest possible chance and has the evidence base behind it to correct facts and not reinforce false beliefs. So that is the current best practice, and that is where the evidence base suggests that you have the best chance of debunking or myth busting misinformation is by using that FMFF approach. So I'll now talk to engagement strategies. So the reason we included engagement strategies in the report is that we know that, unfortunately, often misinformation interventions or approaches to debunk misinformation, they only work if people engage with them. And unfortunately, people who are most vulnerable to misinformation are often the least likely to engage with the interventions that are designed to protect them. So it's essential to consider engagement in all communications against misinformation. The report describes 7 behavioural strategies you can use to maximize reach and impact. The first is you want to achieve volume in your messaging. So there's a few ways to do this. There's consistency and repetition in your messaging, but also coordination between different advocacy groups or messengers within your sector. So the more people that see your message, the more credible and trustworthy it is. Secondly, use targeted channels. Reach your audience by meeting them where they're at. So we're currently putting this to the test, and we're developing a short video summary of the framework for video-based social media platforms. Thirdly, use familiar and relatable messengers. We know that people trust messengers they identify with. So what's important is to align the messenger with who your audience trusts. Fourth, we want to leverage social norms. We know that people don't act in isolation, and we care deeply about what others think. Remind your audience that the majority of Australians think immigration has a positive impact on the country. 5, we want to appeal to values and emotions. We know that facts alone aren't enough. Connect with what matters most to people. Because different people prioritize different values, you want to tailor your messages to appeal to the distinct values of your target audience. 6, we want to use humor. Humor can attract people to engage with information they would otherwise be skeptical of. So my organization conducted a large trial in Europe to test different ways of presenting presenting a misinformation intervention on Twitter. And we found that messages that used humorous memes had a 76% higher engagement rate than standard messages. And finally, time is of the essence. You want to act quickly. Misinformation spreads rapidly because it's more novel, emotionally charged, and persuasive than the truth. The more times people see the misinformation, the bigger the harm. So the earlier you act, the better. Okay, so that's a very quick tour through the framework, and we can go into it in a little bit more detail through the Q&A with what time's left. But for now, I'll hand back to Daniel to wrap things up.
Thanks so much, Saul. So in summary, this report equips you to respond to misinformation in different situations. It provides the foundation for you to develop tailored messaging and campaigns that align with your expertise, scope, and voice. But it's only valuable if you feel empowered to use it, share it, and spread the good information. And for us at the Kaldor Centre, we see this just as a first step. We're very open to supporting more work in this area if it's valuable and if it can be effective. One of the key takeaways from the report is that for best results, campaigns should be coordinated between an ecosystem of allied actors. And we are really keen to explore what that would look like and our role in that ecosystem. But we're really keen to hear from you in terms of what would be useful. And so now we're happy to turn to your questions about the framework, but also hear your thoughts on what it should lead to next.
Daniel, there's a question about suggested approaches and steps for reframing the agenda. I could talk to that for a minute.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So this is a good question. Just before this presentation, I went through the report and I was looking for more detail on this approach because I wanted to provide good advice on this. And there isn't a structured way to do this according to the literature on misinformation. But the way that we interpret this in the report is it's more about continue with your business as usual messaging and campaigns, but do so in a way that is values driven and will increase the contextual knowledge and understanding around the issue of refugees and migrants in Australia, so that you embed the sorts of values and knowledge that will help people resist future misinformation. And I think that there's these 7 strategies that are on the screen at the moment are a good way to help boost your approach. But really, this is about just continuing to do the good work that you do and coordinate that good work between all the actors in your sector to make sure that you're all together raising that level of understanding, knowledge, and positive values in Australian society.
Yeah, so it's just really about, I mean, in its simplest form, it's about telling the better story. And you're best positioned to decide what that better story is based on your organization or your goals. So we've got another question here from the chat, Saul. So it says, when trying to influence someone, is there a standard rule about how much of a conversation should be devoted to asking questions of the person you want to influence, vis-a-vis you sharing the facts? And I know this isn't something we covered directly in the report, but as a behavioral science expert, I wonder if you've got any insights on that, Saul.
A really good question. So I'm assuming this is more about face-to-face communication. There's a really good conversation guide that's created by someone called Rebecca Huntley about how to have communication, good conversations about climate change. It's worth having a look at that. But in essence, it's really more about creating a shared understanding, working out where your common values are, because there's always common values. We all care about things like our family, the social fabric that we live in. So it's about finding those common values and then building a shared understanding of that. And then from there, you really have your best chance of influencing someone in a conversation.
And so there's another comment in there in the chat about how acting quickly is so important. But this is an organization coordination issue. And yeah, so then whether Kaldor could do research on how to do this. And yeah, just to say we are actually looking into it, and we're looking at practices in other issue areas, particularly in the around addressing misinformation about climate change, and how there's been some rapid response groups set up there. And yeah, we really welcome any feedback as well on what that could look like in the refugee and migration space here in Australia.
I know we're at time. I could quickly answer Sophie's question about the Flix taxonomy. I would recommend taking a look at the report. It's easily you can Google it online, but we also include it in an appendix in the report. And it just lists out different types of fallacies, and it lists them at a high level. But there's lots of resources online which talk through what they look like. And it's quite fun to use ChatGPT, and then reference the Flick taxonomy. I mentioned this briefly, but you can add a link to a resource that includes all of the fallacies in the Flick taxonomy. And then if you enter the misinformation that you want to debunk, it could help you identify what the fallacy is, and it can even help craft a debunking message using the FMFF framework that we talked to today.
Unfortunately, we're at time. I see there's some other great questions and comments in the chat. Feel free to send me an email if you'd like to discuss any of this further. And I'd just like to wrap up by first thanking you all for joining us today, but also thanking the Knights Family Jabula Foundation for generously supporting this important research. Thank you.